good afternoon, everyone. I anticipated today being a little bit more of a rainy day, but it has been at least partly cloudy today, which is nice to look outside. And we are thankful to have the opportunity to study with you this afternoon. Thankful to have my friend Alan here with us again as we continue to work through the text of the book of Genesis. We are picking up where we left off in our last study in Genesis chapter 29. We're going to be looking at beginning in verse number 31 this afternoon. We're going to be continuing to look at the journey that Jacob finds himself on within this story of Genesis. In our last study, we're able to look at him coming to find his wives. Even though he went just looking for a wife, he ends up with two, and we talked about the struggle that he went through with Laban in order to obtain the one he truly sought after, Rachel, but he ends up coming away with a wife in Leah as well. And we're going to look at just the struggle. I think a good word, a single word to describe the scene of what takes place here in this text that we're looking at is simply struggle. There's a number of struggles that are seen here in this text. And as we get into this, we're going to see a number of echoes of previous events, and also echoes that are pointing towards future events. Alan and I both were just talking before we got on here about just the incredible intricacy that we can see between these stories and a number of other stories. And what we're going to do is discuss those as we go throughout this text this afternoon. But before we get into that, I want to kind of get us to understand why is there such struggle here interpersonally between the individuals that are found in this story. Here's what I want for us to consider. Think back to the garden. In the garden, as it was in the way that God created it, there was harmony. There was harmony between God, and there was harmony between mankind. Unfortunately, upon the temptation that was offered up by the serpents and the succumbing of it by Eve and her husband Adam, there's a break in that good harmony. Now there is a separation between man and God because of the presence of sin. But in the moment, as God asks the explanation, he gives the opportunity for repentance. He speaks to Adam. He says, "What's happened?" Adam says, "Well, the woman that you gave me, she gave me this fruit, and I ate of it." Right there, we see Adam. He's blaming not only the woman, his wife Eve, for having offered him this fruit that she took, but he also blames God. And there is that break in harmony, that break in good relationship, not just between God and man, but also between man and man. And that's what we see throughout the rest of the story of the Bible is difficulty in the relationship between God and man, and also extreme difficulty at points between men and men, or husband and wife, or wives in this case, as we're going to see in this story, siblings and in-laws, and just in any relationship you can think of that we find present in the Bible. We're going to find those difficulties between individuals. And we're going to notice that a lot as we go through this text, and just keep that in the background of your mind. Why is that there is such struggle? Well, there's such struggle because of the presence of sin and the ramifications of sin being introduced in the garden, and seeing that difficulty in interpersonal relationships from here on out. Well, that's enough of me rambling, though. Alan, good to see you this afternoon. Hope that you are doing well, and I'm excited to hear what you have to share with us from this text this afternoon. It's a good text full of lots of things for us to chew on, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, kind of piggybacking off what you said. We talked about it earlier. This is one of those couple chapters that it's even as many times as I've read through Genesis, these always just kind of seemed out of place. Like I couldn't quite reason or figure out why they're there. There's nothing, doesn't seem like there's any big theological information there. I mean, the stories are just kind of strange. They don't really jive, since we're not in that ancient context. We don't really know what's going on with all the rods and the poplar and all those, all the sheep and all this farming lingo. So these couple chapters just really, I almost kind of skimmed over them, like almost like we do with genealogies or things like that. They're just difficult. But and it's taken a long time. It's taken some more in-depth study, but like you said, there's so much more in here as you dive in, that it really makes sense when you compare it to, you find parallels with the Exodus. We'll see that there's a lot of parallels between Jacob and his time away from the promised land, and then fleeing from Laban, much like the Exodus generation will do that in Egypt and flee from Pharaoh. So when you start to pick out all of those parallels and all of those interconnections with again, we assume that Moses wrote this and Exodus and Numbers. I mean, he wrote all these, together. We divided into 5 different books, but these are the books of Moses. So we've got one author that is, putting this together. So it makes sense that there's going to be a lot of connections, and I'm convinced that there's not one verse in the Bible that is just fluff, just there to fill space. So even stories like these can have a purpose and teach a lesson. It just might take a little bit more in-depth study or reasoning to get to that. So I'm excited to try to flesh that out today with you.
Right. There's a lot to get to, Alan. Let's pick up where we left off this last Tuesday, as we have just read that Leah was given to Jacob secretly as his first wife. He has a very strong discussion with Laban about why this has happened. Laban says, listen, in this country, we do things the right way. We do things according to the custom. And that's just how it is. The younger is not to be married off before the older. Jacob says, well, hey, now I still want you to give her to me. And if I have to work for you again, I will. And that's what ends up happening. Rachel's given to Jacob at this time, and he works another 7 years. And we see this relationship beginning between the husband, Jacob, and his 2 wives, Rachel and Leah. We read in chapter 29 and verse 31 of Genesis that when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, which she was not the desired spouse. She was not the desired wife that Jacob had. He wanted Rachel. He was given Leah. So when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was unable to conceive. Leah conceived, gave birth to a son, and named him Reuben, for she said, the Lord has seen my affliction. Surely now my husband will love me. She conceived again, gave birth to a son, and said, the Lord heard that I am unloved and has given me this son also. So she named him Simeon. She conceived again, gave birth to a son, and said, at last my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne 3 sons for him. Therefore he was named Levi. And she conceived again, gave birth to a son, and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she named him Judah. And then Leah stopped having children. It is interesting here, Alan, to see that the Lord had compassion upon Leah because she was unloved. And what better way for a wife during this time, especially whenever there are multiple wives in a family unit, what better way to try to help a wife find more favor in the eyes of her husband than to help to introduce children into the relationship, especially male children, that would help for his posterity to be continued in further generations. That's one thing to know here. But Alan, another thing we want to note is these names during this time, and I believe you made this point in a previous study. Names during this time had a lot more meaning than what they have for us today. We often name people, and I believe the podcast we're both listening to, we really enjoy Alistair Roberts. He made this point that now we are normally named after, parents or famous people we like, grandparents, somebody in the family. But during this time, the names were given to have significance in their meaning. Sometimes it was a very literal meaning, like their name literally meant this. But other times, and that's especially what I believe we see with these names, it's the fact that their names sounded like these other words that meant particular things. So why don't you give us a little more detail about the sons of Leah here? She has 4 sons in this text, and let's see what significance that has.
Well, first off, we know the rest of the story of the Bible, so we know that these 12 sons that Jacob will eventually have obviously play a huge role in the story of the Bible. So it makes sense that each one is given at least a moment or two as they're born, just to understand their name. So that's kind of a given. But yeah, you notice there's a commonality with these first 4, the way Leah names them. There's typically a common word. She usually says a phrase of some kind. So for Reuben, she says, "The Lord has seen my affliction. Surely my husband will love me." So you kind of see a progression with these first 4, and you see a commonality, which is the Lord. Each time when she is naming a son, notice verse 33, "The Lord heard that I am unloved," in Simeon. And there's just these, and then verse 35, "This time I will praise the Lord." You get a little bit of glimpse into Leah's character. She's naming these sons with the Lord in mind, and she understands that the Lord has blessed her. And you also see the struggle because she is unloved. She's starting off with Reuben. "Oh, surely now I've got a son. I'm the only one that's born children for him," which would have been a big deal. So, "The Lord has seen my affliction. Surely now my husband will love me." And notice each time it kind of gets more and more sad. Verse 33, "I'm still unloved." So even though she had born Reuben, and now she's bearing Simeon, still not loved by Jacob. And verse 34, she bears Levi. "At last my husband will be attached to me because I born him 3 sons." So it's almost sad that she's still expecting love from Jacob after, by the 3rd son, she still has not received it. And then notice the changeover with the 4th son, Judah. "This time I will praise the Lord." So you get the sense that, she's kind of given up on expecting to be loved in the way that she wants. But to her credit, her character, she doesn't appear to be bitter about it or angry. She just praises the Lord. Right. And that's kind of, I get some parallels. I think of Job, "The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." It's good things, bad things, whatever. She's praising God with the name of Judah there. So just really interesting to see Leah in this context, and then just the names of each of the boys as well.
Right, and thank you for giving the explanation. And I was listening as best I could. There were some technical difficulties I was dealing with. The screen was frozen on the previous text I had. Never, I pulled up Olive Tree earlier and had to get that fixed up. So forgive me if you mentioned this, but not only is it that these names had significance in what Leah was feeling at this moment, but they're also going to have some significance in the future. We'll see that what we're going to see. Maybe coincidentally, maybe not, that the way these people, these children or names are going to play into the kind of the character they have later on in some different parts of the story as Abraham's lineage continues on in this text of Genesis. So let's continue on in the text, beginning in chapter 30 and verse 1. We're going to see Rachel's reaction to this. So remember the context of all this taking place, that there is Rachel and Leah. Leah is the older sister. She was to be married off first, but she was not in the mind of Jacob. He was working for the younger sister, which once all of this starts happening with the let me turn off this.
You're always blowing up at the worst time, man.
On here, I'm just going to start muting conversations. Whenever this deception of Laban comes in, he ends up giving Leah to Jacob, and then he also receives Rachel. I think it's important for us to kind of see this from the perspective of these women in this story, think of from Leah's perspective, we see that, I believe, in verse 31 through the end of chapter 29, that from her perspective, she's unloved. She's in a marriage that was not desired, and the way for her to gain some favorability in her husband's eyes is to produce sons. Well, on the flip side here, we're looking at it from Rachel's perspective. Rachel is the desired wife, and yet she's not able to give to her husband what was most valued in this society and in this culture, which was children, which is why we see in verse number 1, when Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she envied her sister. You know, she's looking at this sister who's not even wanted really in this relationship, who is not loved, and yet here she is giving children to her husband, and she says, "Give me sons or I will die." And she says this to Jacob, which on Jacob's part, Jacob's like, "Well, why are you getting mad at me?" Jacob became angry with Rachel and said, "Am I in God's place who has withheld offspring from you?" I'm not guessing that it wasn't that the act of what normally brings children into existence wasn't taking place. Jacob said, "I'm doing my part. It's not having to do with me. I'm not the one who determines whether or not you conceive." And so what we have here then is another episode of a wife not being able to conceive and then giving a maid to her husband, which we saw this earlier with Abraham and Sarah, that Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham to bring about children in that family. And here we see
that always fixes things, doesn't it?
Always fixes things every time. Tell you what, it's just always good to add more women into the relationship. Always going to be a good thing. And that's of course what we see here. Here is my maid Bilhah, go sleep with her, and she'll bear children for me. So that through her, I too can build a family. Which that's strange to us, very foreign to us, to think that through another person that Rachel believes she would be bearing a family, but that's just the structure of relationships in the family unit at this time. So verse number 4, Rachel gave her slave Bilhah to Jacob as a wife, which is the exact same thing we saw. She goes from maid to now wife status, and he slept with her. And then verse number 4, verse number 5, Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. And Rachel said, "God has vindicated me. Yes, he has heard me and given me a son." So she named him Dan. And Rachel's slave Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, "In my wrestlings with God, I have wrestled with my sister and won." And she named him Naphtali. So we see here this whole rivalry that is present here in this marriage relationship between Jacob and these two sisters. Rivalry that is certainly born from everything that took place with Laban giving the older sister in place of the younger sister. And all it has caused in this marriage relationship so far is just turmoil. It is not the picture of a loving relationship and loving marriage that God intended in the beginning. And it all comes through this envy and jealousy, and it's just I couldn't imagine to be in a relationship such as this with all of this turmoil and strife being present. But notice what Leah does, verse number 9. Leah saw that she had stopped having children, which is what we see at the end of verse number 29, or excuse me, in chapter 29. So she took her slave, Zilpah, and gave her to Jacob as a wife. You know, if Rachel's going to do this in order to gain honor, then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm not having any more children, so this is what I'm going to do. So Leah's a slave, Zilpah, verse number 10, bore Jacob a son. And then Leah said, "What good fortune," and named him Gad. And when Leah's slave Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, Leah said, "I am happy that the women call me happy." So she named him Asher. Alan, can you make any sense of this just craziness that is present in this relationship at this time?
We've already talked about Leah seeming to have at least some good qualities. Definitely Rachel obviously is the first one to initiate this, hey, have my handmaid or have my servant and have children by her. I'd be surprised if she hadn't heard the story of Jacob's family and ancestors and how that kind of worked out with Abraham and Isaac. I mean, Abraham was alive it would seem, when Jacob and Esau were born. So I can't imagine Jacob didn't know that story and how that turned out. So you kind of understand Rachel doing this. It's a little sad because, all of these women, Sarah at the beginning, and then, Rachel and Rachel here, they're trying so hard to have children, and you don't see much going to God in prayer. It seems like you're always seeing them try to get things done their way, and it usually ends up delaying the process. We know that Rachel eventually does have a son, but she gives her handmaiden to Jacob, so she has two sons. Well, there's 18 months at least of time that that might have delayed. If she would have just trusted and been patient, maybe she could have had a son earlier. We'll see in just a little bit. She tries this whole, instead of going to God in prayer, she tries this whole thing with the mandrakes in verse 14. So again, just doing whatever she can apart from God to make this process happen. And Leah, to her not her credit, she follows suit. Leah didn't really need to be involved in giving handmaidens over to her husband, but she isn't immune to this jealousy as well, and she does the same thing with her slave Zilpah. And it's kind of interesting, the names that are given, Gad and Asher, in verse 11, and then verse 13, they're both talking about being good fortune or happy. So she doesn't really see the problem with all that as well. And it's a little sad for Leah because she's already born 4 children. I mean, that's pretty good. She should be fairly well satisfied with that. But, and she's still ahead of the game, even if you count Bilhah's 2 sons that she bore for Rachel, she's still up 4-2 at this point. So, she's obviously more fertile than any of the others, but she was not immune to a little bit of jealousy here.
Yeah, I just forgot what I was going to say. Here it is. You would hope that in this situation that someone at some point would stand up and be the bigger person. That's really what you're hoping would be the case here. And maybe that kind of is what ends up happening here in verse 14 with this situation with Reuben and the mandrakes, Leah and Rachel, depending on how you understand what's taking place here. In verse 14, Reuben went out, and Reuben at this point would have been a young, if this is in somewhat chronological order, if this is happening kind of in sequence, then Reuben would be a young boy still. And Reuben went out during the wheat harvest and found some mandrakes in the field. And when he brought them to his mother Leah, Rachel asked, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But Leah replied to her, "Isn't it enough that you have taken my husband? Now you also want to take my mandrake or my son's mandrakes?" This is a story that's caused a number of commentators and just students of the Bible, cause them to just have a hard time understanding what's going on. And a lot of focus is often given on, well, what were these mandrakes? And mandrakes meant different things and have been known to have different effects. Sometimes they were used for fertility. Sometimes they were used as an aphrodisiac. Sometimes they were just flowers or some sort of vegetation. To me, this just seems like a simple example of a young boy going out and finding something he sees as pretty and then giving it to his mom as a gift. And yet here we have Rachel interjecting herself into the situation and asks for some of this. And Leah flies off and says, "You want my husband? Now do you want my son's mandrakes as well?" Alan, what do you think is going on here in this situation?
Well, yeah, I definitely agree. I think the reason Rachel is wanting these mandrakes is, for whatever reason, whatever cultural idea they had back then, they thought that would increase fertility in some way. So she's trying whatever she can to have a kid and to get pregnant. It's just a little sad and ironic that she exchanges a night with Jacob for these mandrakes, and who's the one that ends up getting pregnant in that exchange? Well, it's going to be Leah.
Mhm.
Leah's the one that gets pregnant, and Rachel doesn't. So, kind of ironic that, and of course we've seen that throughout the text so far. Someone tries something that's of their own accord, and the opposite thing happens. Like we keep referencing the Tower of Babel. They're trying to, build this tower to the heavens, and they're trying not to be scattered. And then what happens? They get scattered. Rachel's trying to get pregnant, so she grabs these mandrakes and makes an exchange for them. And she doesn't get pregnant. It's Leah that gets pregnant with another kid, and she's already had 4. So just kind of a little, it's almost humorous at this point, just how sad, but also how just how everything's happening. And of course, the whole thing is that Jacob is obviously multiplying pretty quick, and that's the point of these stories, just to show how that happened, and how the Lord was the one in control with all this, even though he was not, like, I could not say that the Lord wanted these 2 women to marry Jacob, and that's how he wanted all this to happen. No, but Jacob is going to be fruitful and multiply no matter what happens with Leah and Rachel and the 2 servants that they give to Jacob. It's going to happen. They try to do it their own way, but God's will is going to be done even so.
Absolutely. The Lord's going to take whatever situation is given to the people that he's going to use, and he's going to use it well to accomplish whatever it is that he is wanting to accomplish. I kind of like what Alistair Roberts, how he looks at this text, and I appreciate, I guess, just because maybe it's more of an optimistic take on the text than what might actually be true. Again, with just a short snippet of verses like this, it's hard to know exactly what's kind of the underlying thoughts of it. We can obviously see what ends up being the results, and I don't disagree at all that if this does have something to do with fertility being enhanced through these mandrakes, then Rachel's ulterior motives are probably easily seen. But I like what Robert says here. He says, this almost seems to be a bit of a branch of reconciliation being offered here from Rachel to Leah. Now, just for a second, think about Leah's response here. Isn't it enough that you have taken my husband? Now you also want to take my son's mandrakes. Let's take a second and just think of it again from the perspective of these women in this situation. Think of it. Leah is the unloved, the unwanted wife, and yet she was given, as is the custom, to Jacob in this marriage. And in her mind, she might be thinking, this isn't what was expected, but this is what is. In her mind, she's probably thinking, Rachel, I've got the guy, you go find your own guy now. That's probably what she was expecting, probably without stretching it too far, probably what she wanted. She would have much preferred just to be in this marriage, in this relationship with Jacob. And yet what happens is that this marriage bed that had been made between Leah and Jacob, well, it's now been invaded by Rachel. So here's Rachel now taking the time and the love and the affection from Leah, seeing it from Leah's perspective, taking it from her for herself. So now here in this situation, we have Rachel seeing this son showing love towards his mother, giving this gift, and looking at it from Leah's perspective, here is Rachel now coming in and taking her son's love too. You've already taken my husband's love by interjecting yourself into a marriage that was already created. And now here you are taking my son's love away from me as well. And maybe at this moment, this response that Rachel has, well, then he can sleep with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. Maybe that's her. Maybe I'm saying maybe just because I'm just not sure. But maybe this is her saying, I get it. I can see where it is that you're coming from. And you know what? If you would give me some of these mandrakes, and if we're thinking about this being for fertility purposes, I will allow him to be with you this evening. Again, I'm not sure what is the right take on that, but I think there is a plausibility of some merit to those thoughts that Robert has. But what you said, Alan, if this is purely ulterior motives from Rachel to try to have some children herself, then it does completely backfire. And that's kind of what Jason says here. And there's always a number of problems that happen whenever men try to help God. And what we see then is that whenever Jacob came in, verse 16, in from the field that evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, hey, I warn you tonight, basically. You must come with me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrake. Basically, I have bought you with my son's mandrake. So Jacob slept with her that night, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. And Leah said, God has rewarded me for giving my slave to my husband. Don't quite know if that's true or not, but she named him Issachar. And then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. God has given me a good gift, Leah said. This time my husband will honor me because I have borne 6 sons for him. She named him Zebulun. Later, Leah bore a daughter, first daughter we've seen given here, and named her Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel. So after all these children that had been given to all these other women, first to Leah, then to Bilhah, then to Zilpah, now God remembers Rachel, which is, I believe, the third time we've seen this type of language of God remembering people. We see it also in chapter 18 and chapter 19. That God remembers Rachel. He listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son, and she said, God has taken away my disgrace. She named him Joseph and said, may the Lord add another son to me.
So that name there is interesting. Remember what the first 4 children that Leah bore seemed like all of them had something to do with God. I mean, she was worried about getting love from her husband. She at least mentioned God in all of that. But notice what Rachel names him Joseph, and she mentions God, but may he add another. She's not even just thankful that I finally got a son. She's already thinking about, hey, give me another one. Mm-hmm. So you just kind of get that sense that she's just trying to catch up. She's not even care as much about having the son. She just wants to beat Leah in some way.
For her, it's all about the scorecard, it seems. Mm-hmm. Always checking the scoreboard. She's not really concerned about the actual circumstances of the game. She just wants to know what is the score. And for her, the score has still not been settled at all. As we continue on through the text, Alan, we're going to come across another, actually, what seems to be a desired transition at this point in this text. Remember, at this point, it would be that Jacob would have been in the land of Padan Aram with his now father-in-law for around 20 years or so. The 14 that have been working, and I think there's 6 years that is going to be mentioned here in just a moment. And in his mind, it's now time for him to go out on his own. And he has spent more than enough time here, and he's ready to go onto his homeland. Verse 25 said that after Rachel gave birth to Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, send me on my way so that I can return to my homeland. Give me my wives and my children that I have worked for, and let me go. You know how hard I've worked for you. But Laban said, if I have found favor with you, stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. And then Laban said, name your wages and I will pay them. So Jacob said to him, verse 29, you know how I have served you, and your herds have fared with me, for you have had very little before I came, but now your wealth has increased. The Lord has blessed you because of me. And now, when will I also do something for my own family? Laban continues on, ask, what should I give you? Jacob said, you don't need to give me anything. If you do this one thing for me, I will continue to shepherd and keep your flock. Let me go through all of your sheep today and remove every sheep that is speckled or spotted, every dark colored sheep among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the female goats. Such will be my wages. You describe these out as being the less attractive looking sheep, which I think is good. Then he says, verse 33, in the future, when you come to check on my wages, my honesty will testify for me. If I have, which is that coming from Jacob is gold. My honesty will testify for me. But if I have any female goats that are not speckled or spotted, or any lambs that are not black, they will be considered stolen. Good, said Laban. Let it be as you have said. And that day Laban removed the streaked and spotted male goats and all the speckled and spotted female goats, every one that had any white on it, and every dark colored one among the lambs. And he placed his sons in charge of them. And he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob. And Jacob, meanwhile, was shepherding the rest of Laban's flock. Oh, man.
Notice what just happened there with Laban. Like they've just agreed that Jacob will get, he'll go and pick out all the ugly ones, and Laban will get all the good looking sheep. Mm-hmm. And so basically Jacob's just going to get kind of the cast offs.
Right.
Okay. And Laban's like, sure, that sounds.
This one already. The very first thing he got from Laban was a cast off.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's some great parallels with Leah and Rachel here. But what does Laban first do? As soon as he says in verse 34, good, let it be as you said, that day Laban removes those and separates them so Jacob can't grab them. So Laban right away is already kind of showing his character. He's going to try to hide, basically remove and hide the ones that Jacob's supposed to take from him. So obviously Laban is not known for being of the highest character here, but it's interesting that not even a split second later, he's already trying to go back on the deal that he's made for Jacob. And of course, we'll see as we keep going that it doesn't matter that the Lord is going to be with Jacob. He's going to make sure that that he increases and that Laban decreases.
Right. And it's so interesting to me in this situation, the fact that these are two men who have both been very conniving up to this point. Neither one of them have been trustworthy, and therefore neither one of them really trusts the other one. You can just sense that as you read this text that Jacob's been saying, listen, I've done you well. And Jacob's thinking in his mind, he must know, yes, you have done me well, and I can't let you go. So what can I do to get you to stay and basically continue to work you on the cheap is really what's going on here. What's interesting to me is the very beginning. Send me on my way, verse 25, so that I can return to my homeland. Give me my wives and my children. Why is it that Jacob would say, give me my wives and my children? It almost seems that he still doesn't feel as if Laban has let go of them, that Laban still sees all these individuals as being his possessions, which is going to be borne out later on in chapter 31 in verse 43, whenever they chase them down. Laban says it in verse 26, he says it, you have deceived and taken my daughters away like prisoners of war. And Jacob says again in chapter 31 and verse 43, the daughters are my daughters, the sons my sons, and the flocks my flocks. He's just a greedy man. He's doing whatever he can to gain up as much wealth for himself as he can. And of course, I may mention as we're reading through just how funny it is for Jacob to say, you can trust me, and my honesty is going to testify for me. Well, that certainly hasn't been the case up to this point. But let's see what Jacob does at this point. So Jacob he's presented an offer to Laban, Alan, that seems good on the surface. You get the pretty sheep, I'll take the not so pretty sheep. But what Jacob does at this point, beginning in verse 37, is that he makes sure that the sheep that he has that have been told that will be his possession, he's going to make sure they prosper. So Jacob then took branches of fresh poplar, almond, and plain wood, and peeled the bark, exposing white strips on the branches. And he set the peeled branches in the troughs in front of the sheep, in the water channels where the sheep came to drink, and the sheep bred when they came to drink. The flock spread in front of the branches and bore streaked, speckled, and spotted young. Then Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face the streaked sheep and the completely dark sheep in Laban's flocks. Then he set his own stock apart and didn't put them with Laban's sheep. And whenever the stronger of the flocks were breeding, Jacob placed the branches in the troughs in full view of the flocks. and they would breed in front of the branches. As for the weaklings of the flocks, he did not put out the branches. So it turned out that the weak sheep belonged to Laban and the stronger ones to Jacob. And the man became very rich, referring to Jacob. He had many flocks, female and male slaves, camels, and donkeys. So here is the, again, another conniving plan that Jacob has come up with that has, from the perspective of the reader, times where he is trying to influence things, but what we're going to see is that the Lord, at the end of the day, was the one behind all of this. But try to make some sense of this, if you could, Alan. How it is that Jacob is trying to make sure that he has the stronger, because again, he gives Laban the prettier, and he takes on the uglier. But at the end, he has the stronger, and Laban has the weaker.
That's the best I can get is what's happening here. He's figuring out how to crossbreed, so where basically the stronger sheep are producing strong sheep, but they're producing strong ugly sheep, the speckled and the spotted. And then the opposite's happening. The ones that are coming out white and might be more beautiful, but they are the weaker ones. And then, of course, Jacob's supposed to get all of the uglier looking sheep, but through this process, he's getting the uglier ones, but might be more fertile and stronger. And then Laban's getting they might be white and prettier, but they are weaker. And I mentioned before, there's some just the perfect parallel of Leah and Rachel. We talked about Rachel being this great beauty, and Leah seemingly not so much. And who ends up being the most fertile? Who has 6 children? That's Leah. She's not as pretty to look at, but she is stronger in the sense that she has more children. And then the pretty beautiful one, Rachel, struggles to have children. So you got some fun little parallels there. But I think the main thing comes right at the end, and the man became very rich. Verse 43. He had many flocks, female, male slaves, and camels and donkeys. This is just explaining why and how Jacob becomes rich and powerful, and just like God had promised Abraham and Isaac. I mean, he's going to be blessed, and no matter how it happens, that promise is going to come about. Mm-hmm. And that's what's happening here with Jacob.
And it was not escaping the notice of others. That's what we're going to see in chapter 31 and verse 1. Now Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying. So Laban's sons are seeing what's happening here. They are seeing that Jacob's flocks, though they might not be as good looking, they are a much stronger flock. And what they're saying is that Jacob has taken all that was our father's and has built his wealth from what belonged to our father. And Jacob saw from Laban's face that his attitude toward him was not the same as before. And the Lord said, "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you." Jacob had Rachel and Leah called to the field where his flocks were. And he said to them, "I can see from your father's face that his attitude towards me is not the same as before. But the God of my father has been with me. You know that with all my strength I have served your father, and that he has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times, but God has not let him harm me. If he said, the spotted sheep will be your wages, then all the sheep were born spotted. If he said, the streaked sheep will be your wages, then all the sheep were born streaked. God has taken away your father's herds and given them to me. And when the flocks were breeding, I saw in a dream that the streaked, spotted, and speckled males were mating with the females. And in that dream, the angel of God said to me, Jacob. And I said, here am I. And he said, look up and see. All the males that are mating with the flocks, with the flock, are streaked, spotted, and speckled. For I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you poured oil on the stone marker and made a solemn vow to me. Get up, leave this land, and return to your native land. So again, what has been taking place here with Jacob's flocks, him increasing and Laban seemingly decreasing, it's being seen by those within Laban's household. And here is Jacob having to figure out what he's going to do. So he is calling here basically his flock to himself. Remember that Leah's name means cow, heifer, and Rachel's name means ewe. So there's a lot of this, it's kind of farm animal language. So you can almost read verse 4 that Jacob had his flock come to the field where his other flocks were. And he's going to explain to them exactly what needs to take place at this point. But Alan, what do you see as Jacob seeing God's influence in this situation?
Well, that's key in Jacob's growth. He's definitely farther along in the process of his faith than maybe he was back at Bethel or back in the Promised Land. So hopefully, I think he's starting to see God's promise. I mean, he's seeing God's promises being fulfilled. I will be with you. I will bring you back. I'll make you a great nation. I mean, he's had children upon children. He's grown in wealth. And, every time he mentions God, verse 9, God has taken away your father's herds and given them to me. He's seeing that this isn't, yes, he might have manipulated the process himself some, but he's seeing the true hand of God is in all of this. So we're starting to get more and more faith. And of course, he's still being contacted by God. He had a dream talking about this angel that came to him in a dream and told him all these things. He's relaying that to Rachel and Leah. Let's see, verse 11. In the dream, the angel of God said to me, Jacob, and I said, here I am. And he said, look up and see all the males that are mating with the flocks are streaked and speckled, for I have seen all that Laban has done to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you poured oil. And the marker made a solemn vow to me, get up, leave this land, and return to your native land. So I like that in verse 11. God says Jacob, and he says, here I am. We've seen that before with Abraham in chapter 22. God came to him, said, Abraham, here I am. And then God commanded him to do something very difficult. And this command would have been difficult, to return to the land. I mean, he's been gone for 20 years. When he left, he was fleeing for his life from Esau. So he doesn't know what's going to happen if he returns. And he also doesn't know what's going to happen when he leaves. He seems to be afraid of Laban because he leaves in the dead of night and sneaks away. So he's in a tough situation. He can't stay. He probably doesn't really want to go back because he doesn't know what'll happen there. So he's really worried. And for God to come at this point is obviously, I think, no accident, to come and give him assurance and give him a command, and Jacob has to follow it.
Yeah, to build on what you said, these things taking place at night, Roberts talks about there's just a very dark cloud, almost a nighttime type of perception that is seen in this entire story, a dark portion of this story. So many things are taking place at night, really. Just the overall air of it is very dark. But you may mention on the Facebook comment thread the fact that there are a number of aspects of this text that are going to be echoed in the Exodus story. One of them, just beginning with Jacob, that Jacob comes to Laban has nothing. And think about the children of Israel coming into Joseph and his brothers and their family coming down into Egypt and having nothing, very, very little to nothing. And yet while they're there, they're able to grow and to multiply and be blessed. Obviously, God being the reason for that. And yet while they're being blessed, they're actually being oppressed. The Israelites, the children of Jacob here, they're going to be oppressed by the Egyptians and by the Pharaohs. And here is Jacob and his family being oppressed by this man Laban. There's a quick and very sudden escape from the land of Egypt just as there's going to be a quick and sudden escape from Laban's house by Jacob. And then you can also look at the humiliation of the pagan idols that we're going to see here in just a few moments as they're introduced into the story. That's also seen in Exodus. And then going forward, we're also going to see a number of echoes that are coming from the garden. You think about this story and the consequences of the fall. Well, the two main ones that we can think of, number one, would be the difficulty in childbirth. We're seeing that kind of here, just the whole procreation process here in this story. And we're especially going to see it whenever it comes to Rachel, that she's going to die in childbirth. But we also see the struggling of the husband and the man in providing for his family, and the struggle that's going to be seen in that. That's what we're seeing here. It gives further evidence for us to try to see Scripture on a deeper level, and to see how these themes show up time and time again, that we can trace so many things in these different stories back to an original point, and really just shows what is true about the writing of Ecclesiastes, that there's nothing new under the sun, that things seem to come in cycles and happen time and time again. Let's see, Alan, the response of Rachel and Leah in this text. Where are we at here?
Yeah, verse 14.
Thank you, verse 14. And before we do that, let me mention one more thing, that it's noted here that Jacob has seen that there's been a change in Laban's demeanor towards him and the way that Laban sees him. Think about what happened whenever Jacob first got there. That Jacob approaches this land. He tells Rachel, I am your, I guess it would be your aunt's, Rebecca's son. She goes and tells Laban, hey, your nephew is here, the son of Abraham and Rebecca, or excuse me, Isaac and Rebecca. And Laban's first reaction has to go back to what happened whenever Eleazar of Damascus, the chief servant of Abraham's family, had come, and he had brought all these gifts that were given to them in exchange for Rebecca going to Isaac, and yet there was nothing. He comes out and there's nothing. Jacob has nothing. And though he becomes a son-in-law, Laban doesn't treat Jacob as a son-in-law, it seems. Because what you would expect whenever a son-in-law comes to father-in-law and says, hey, it's time for me to take my family and go, you would expect at that point for the father-in-law to say, absolutely, you go be your own family, and here are a number of gifts and goods for me to bless you on your way out. And that's just not what Laban does here. Laban doesn't see Jacob as a true son-in-law. He sees him more as a servant, as someone who provides for his needs. And he doesn't really seem to see Leah and Rachel as daughters anymore. They're just people within his own household. And notice how that shows up here in verse 14, that not only has Jacob seen this in Laban, but Rachel and Leah seem to have seen a change in their father. They answered Jacob, do we have any portion or inheritance in our father's family? Are we not regarded by him as outsiders? For he has sold us and has certainly spent our purchase price. In fact, all the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. So do whatever God has said to you. So Jacob got up and put his children and wives on the camels. He took all the livestock and possessions he acquired in Padan Aram, and he drove his herds to go to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. And when Laban had gone to shear his sheep, Rachel stole her father's household idols or teraphim. And Jacob deceived Laban, the Aramean, not telling him that he was fleeing. He fled with all his possessions, crossing the Euphrates, and headed for the hill country of Gilead. Alan, what do you make of Rachel and Leah's response here to what Jacob has told them, specifically what they say about how their father has treated them?
It makes sense. I mean, he really has treated them like possessions. I mean, he's sold them for 7 years each of labor from Jacob. Just used them. I mean, and that's what women were considered back then. I mean, they're commodities to be bartered, traded, and given in marriage to, just to ally yourself with another powerful family or nation or something. So it's normal for this time, but clearly Rachel and Leah have no more love for their father because of that. And they also they've seen what's happening as well, that Jacob is increasing and their father is decreasing. So it's kind of a little bit of comeuppance and just desserts for Laban, who's been trying to deceive and get all this from Jacob. And in fact, the exact opposite happens. All of his wealth becomes Jacob's, and Rachel and Leah understand that. And their mention of God here too, I think is important, because this is, they at least have some understanding of the promises and allying themselves with Jacob, one of the patriarchs.
Mm-hmm.
But they're gung-ho. They say, hey, whatever God has said, do it. We're with you. With what portion have we left in Laban's house? I mean, no point in staying at this point. And this is all this kind of got started back in chapter 30, when Rachel finally had a son. So it would seem that Laban was definitely considering those daughters still his, but Rachel, and he might have had a case if Rachel had never born children, but Rachel had born a son to Jacob. So I think that's why at that point Jacob starts to initiate this leaving process, because she's really tied to him by a common child now, than more than before. But yeah, they're willing to go with him, and they know, they've seen what's happened with Laban over these years.
Yeah, and Laban is finally going to see what has taken place. Remember, there's this 3-day journey that was set up between Laban and Jacob. So on that 3rd day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled. So he took his relatives with him, pursued Jacob for 7 days, and overtook him in the hill country of Gilead. But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream at night. Watch yourself, God warned him. Don't say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. And when Laban overtook Jacob, Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban and his relatives also in the hill country of Gilead. Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done? You have deceived me and taken my daughters away like prisoners of war. Why did you secretly flee from me, deceive me, and not tell me? I would have sent you away with joy and singing, with tambourines and lyres." I'm sure that's the case. Sure, Laban, I'm sure. But you didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters. You have acted foolishly. I could do you great harm, but last night the God of your father said to me, "Watch yourself. Don't say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Now you have gone off because you long for your father's family, but why have you stolen my gods?" Jacob answered, "I was afraid, for I thought you would take your daughters from me by force. If you find your gods with anyone here, he will not live. And before our relatives point out anything that is yours and take it." Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the idols. So Laban went in Jacob's tents, Leah's tents, and the tents of the 2 concubines, but he found nothing. And when he left Leah's tent, he went into Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken Laban's household idols, put them in the saddlebag of the camel, and sat on them. Laban searched the whole tent, but found nothing. And she said to her father, Don't be angry, my lord, that I cannot stand up in your presence, for I am having my period." So Laban searched, but could not find the household idols. I'll tell you, Laban and Jacob both are just funny characters in the fact that they could say things and maybe in their minds think that it's reality, but from our perspective, they could not seem further from the truth. The fact that he says, "I would have sent you away with joy and singing, with tambourines and lyres." Well, hold on a second. Didn't Jacob try to leave earlier? Isn't that what we read in chapter 30 and verse 25, that he said, "Hey, send me away to my family," and Laban would not let him? Interesting to me, Alan. What do you think?
It is ironic, because back then, because of Jacob working for him for 14 years at that point, Laban was wealthy. He was rich. He had all these flocks and things. If he would have let them leave then, and even given them, more than enough to get started, and camels and flocks and stuff, if he'd have given them their just inheritance, the two daughters, what they were owed, and even as a gift, just giving them that gift, he would have still been fine. Like, he would have had a ton of other sheep and other flocks and other wealth. But now Jacob's taking everything with him, and we'll see later, Laban acknowledges that. He's like, I've got nothing to give you at this point anyway. So he ends up making a covenant with them. That's the only gift he can give them as they leave. So it's just ironic, I would have sent you off with this, great party and great gifts. He's got nothing left to give. That's why he's chasing after him, because I guess he's hoping to try to get some of that back, but it's not going to happen.
Right. And at this point, there's really nothing that Laban can say except, hold on, somebody has taken my household idols, which is something that has been referred to earlier. The fact that he said that through divination, he knew that God had blessed him through Jacob. And Rachel here, again, just kind of showing the type of character she has. She stole those things. She stole those idols, as they would be, from her father. And she puts them on her camel, it says. Let's see here. Let me get down to the text. Put them in the saddlebag of the camel, and then she sat on them and searched the whole tent, but found nothing. And the custom at this time was that whenever it was that time of the month for the ladies, it was a time of impurity. And so they had to be treated very delicately, which is why she says, I can't stand up right now. It is this time for me. And it's interesting if we put this together, knowing that Rachel has the idols, and then going back to what Jacob says, if you find someone who has it, then he will not live. Well, that is unintended foreshadowing, of course, that Rachel does end up dying prematurely, that she does not live to a ripe old age because of giving birth to Benjamin. So there's a lot of kind of background connections that we can make here between what's taking place here with Jacob and Laban and Rachel, and what we're going to see later on in the story of Rachel. And just think about the difficulty that comes for her children. Think about the fact that whenever Joseph is stolen basically from his father, what is it that they hold up? Well, look at this bloody rag. That ties into the story here. Think about her son Benjamin, the fact that later on in the judge's account, that the whole tribe is almost wiped out because of their immorality. It's sad that we see the type of character of their mother ends up having some sort of influence on their story that they enjoy as they go throughout the rest of the text.
We've mentioned a lot of parallels with the Exodus narrative and in the book of Exodus, and throughout that narrative, especially the 10 plagues, the kind of an underlying theme during that time was all those plagues usually had something to do with an Egyptian god. And the fact that, every single plague seemed to basically tear down another god of Egypt in some way. This god that should have been the god of, the god of fertility, or the god of the crops or whatever. Well, then the god of the Nile, and then the Nile turns to blood. It's basically just showing, each of those plagues was showing that those gods had no power. And I think you see that underlying through this whole chapter, the fact that God, Jacob's God, has the power, and Laban's gods do not. Consistently throughout this narrative, God is the one that is blessing Jacob at the expense of Laban and his gods. And I think this is like the climax of it right here with Rachel. Like, those gods don't even have enough power to remain where they are. They are stolen by a woman, and then they're rendered unclean because they're sitting underneath her when she's on her period.
Right.
I mean, that's about as at least religiously and to the Israelites of Moses' day, that would have been as shameful as possible.
Absolutely.
And that's the idea. I mean, these gods are nothing. They have no power. They are stolen. They're just things, and they are unclean. They're pointless. They're stupid. And compare that to the one true God who is in control of this entire narrative.
Right. So just for the sake of time, we won't finish out reading the rest of this chapter 31, but I encourage you to do so on whenever you have an opportunity. But just to summarize, Jacob says, what's my crime? I haven't done anything. In fact, I've worked hard for you. I have produced much for you. He says in verse 41, for 20 years in your household, I'll serve you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks. And you've changed wages on me 10 times. He says, listen, I'm done. I am done with this. But if we're going to make this covenant, I want you to know that the God of Abraham, and then he refers to God as the fear of Isaac. The only 2 times we see that described in the Bible is found here in Genesis 31. He says that he has seen what I've done. He is my witness. He can attest to the work I've done for you. So Laban still is thinking that these people are mine. These are my daughters. They're my sons. They're my flocks. But what I can do today for these daughters of mine or for the children they have born, what can I do? There's nothing. He's like, let's make a covenant. Let's make peace. And that's what they end up doing. Jacob again grabs a rock, and they grab multiple rocks and build a mound here to memorialize this covenant. They make a covenant beginning in verse 48. Laban calls upon his gods as witnesses to the covenant, and also the God of Abraham. And then Jacob, he swears just by the fear of his father Isaac. And they offer a sacrifice, and they're able to go about their way after a meal is shared and a night's sleep has been enjoyed. And that finishes up the ordeal that we have here between Jacob and Laban. Though we're going to see on Tuesday, the work or the difficulty for Jacob is not over. For now, it is time for him to be reunited with his brother Esau. That's what we'll pick up with on Tuesday at 3 p.m. Alan, do you have any closing thoughts for our study this afternoon?
I was just thinking this last verse 53. Laban is still, he's equating the God of Abraham. He acknowledges his presence, I guess, and he knows him, but he also talks about and the gods of Nahor.
Mm-hmm.
So the God of Abraham and he puts them on the same plane. And then what does Jacob swear by? He swears by the fear of his father Isaac. He doesn't even acknowledge the gods of Nahor. They're pointless. So obvious differences between Jacob and Laban there, and I think that's showing definitely some growth as well. We haven't seen Jacob ever worshiping or acknowledging other gods, but just the fact that he does that in front of his father-in-law, and I think couldn't have gone unnoticed.
Right. All right, Alan, thanks so much for sharing with us and your wisdom. I know that you put a lot of time, and I know both of us, there's a number of resources that we'd like to share, and they're not resources that take little time to read or listen to and consider. So I know that you put a lot of time into this. Thank you for that. Thank you for your participation in the study. Thank you to all those who have joined us in this study today. I hope that you've been blessed by it, that your Bible knowledge has increased, maybe become even just a little bit sharper. The greater our Bible knowledge, the sharper our Bible knowledge, the greater our faith and trust can be in God. That is something that I am very much convinced of, and I hope that you've seen that as we've gone through this study. Hope that you have a great rest of your Friday. Enjoy this weekend. Hopefully the rain will hold off, though I do see some darker clouds in the distance. But I do hope you enjoyed the weekend. Hope you, I guess, a holiday weekend. Isn't that right, Alan? Is that this weekend, holiday weekend?
Yep, that's Monday, Memorial Day.
Memorial Day is on Monday. We hope that you enjoy this weekend. For those of our church family here, we are so excited to be able to meet together again. I realize that there'll be a number of our church family that won't be able to meet for various reasons. We will miss them, but I do look forward to seeing who I'll be able to see on Sunday. Hope that you all are able to worship in some way this weekend as well. And may God be glorified in everything that we do. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Take care, and we will see you all soon. Hope you'll join us again on Tuesday. as we continue to walk through his story. Everyone, take care, and we will see you soon.